morning. Welcome to another weekly update. Hope you're having a great week. Not loads and loads of things to talk about this week, but there are a couple of things. So good to talk through some of those in some detail. So, a couple of blog posts, a video series, and then a video. And we're going to go through in that order. So, let's start right at the beginning. Something very pertinent for Teams developers specifically, around debugging Teams apps locally using the Teams Toolkit. I know I've talked about this before, and I've featured it in talks when I do talks as well, using the Teams Toolkit and how you can debug your Teams applications locally. Tomomi has written up a really nice blog post on the devblogs.microsoft.com blog site going through this process. And as I was reading this through, it kind of struck me that I haven't done a similar write-up, but I don't need to now because this is a really good one. I know I've covered it in videos and stuff like that, but it's really good to see like a really nice write-up about it. So I'm going to put a link to this in the notes. And so you can see there's a few things going on here. So debugging with F5, and actually it's quite nice to go through the process of what happens. So Teams Toolkit to go and get your app started. I've talked about that before. You can go and watch videos of me talking about that, so I'm not kind of going to cover it now. But this blog post goes through some of the detail about what happens when you click F5, how you can use breakpoints, and then some new stuff actually about what's new in the latest version of the toolkit. Prerequisite checker. This is interesting because it goes through the detail of what happens when you press that F5 key. It does take a little bit of time every time to do it, and it can be interesting to kind of read through the console log as you see things happening. There's a bunch of different things that happen, and it's good to see some of the detail here, along with some customization you have over that experience, so you can choose what happens here as well. Then there's some other things as well that have been added. You can use your own bot endpoint, you can use your own certificates, bunch of manual customization. So it's great to have this level of detail from somebody who really understands what that local debug process is and all the code that happens when you press F5, because if you don't know what it is, it can feel a little bit like a black box, right? Where you press F5, magic happens, and then suddenly your app is running in Teams and you've got local debug, which is really useful if you just want to get started building and you want to dive straight into customizing your application. But if you want to understand a bit more about what those steps are, then it can feel a bit like a black box. So this is a really nice blog post to help fill in some of those gaps, fill in some of those details. So I'll put a link to that in the description. Definitely worth a read through. And some of it goes into quite a lot of detail, so you'll probably want to read through with Teams Toolkit open as well, just to kind of make sure you figure out. And if you haven't done anything with Teams Toolkit and building Teams apps, definitely worth looking at. There's some links in her blog post as well to the Getting Started page as well, and I've done a bunch of videos as well on getting started using Teams Toolkit. All right, so that's a kind of really good blog post to read this week if you're developing on the Teams platform. All right, next up. So this one is one of those blog posts that probably shouldn't affect you, but it might. TLS certificate changes, everyone's favourite subject. There's a whole bunch of cert changes coming to Microsoft 365 services, and that includes Microsoft Teams. Shouldn't really affect anything. It should be one of those changes that just happens on the back end. The current root CA expires in May 25, so they're making they're provisioning a whole bunch of new certificates from a different set of root certificate authorities. They are using DigiCert Global Root G2, which apparently is widely trusted by operating systems everywhere, including Windows, Mac, Android, and iOS. This is one of those things that is just plumbing, so shouldn't affect anyone, right? The only reason this might impact you is if you've written an application in the past, or you maintain an application today, or you haven't yet forgotten about an application you have or that you are responsible for that explicitly specifies a list of acceptable certificate authorities. If that is you, certificate pinning is what it's known as, then you probably want to pay attention and just make sure that you have the new root CA in your list of acceptable CAs, because otherwise you're going to receive validation errors. This covers, it does kind of look like anything that plays well with Teams and possibly Graph as well. So it's teams.microsoft.com, it's skype.com, skypeforbusiness.com, it's communication.azure.com. There's some GCC, DoD, Gov, some of those clouds as well. They're also making changes. There isn't actually specifically anything on Graph actually, so if all your interactions are purely through Graph, you might be all right. But it's probably worth knowing. It's probably worth looking into figuring out if you are using certificate pinning. If you don't know whether you are or not, you're probably not. You'd have to be maintaining a whitelist of acceptable certificates authorities and then checking your certificate as a validation step before you do anything. And most people, you're probably not doing that. All right, so that's coming up. So be aware of that. Yeah, that is coming up. And I'll put a link to the blog post for that as well. All right, I think that's kind of it for like specific news that is super niche to Teams development. A couple of other things I want to talk through. Fellow MVP Starley Hansen has put together an awesome little mini series of 4 videos all around digital wellbeing. So digital wellbeing in Microsoft 365. So this is using Microsoft 365 well and doing so in a way that leaves you super productive and not dropping stuff everywhere and also happy. So Starley has a cool way of doing this actually. He's kind of split it into 4 different areas, like different modules and things to think about. And they're not technology specific, if that makes sense. So the solutions to these kind of areas or these problems, the how-to, if you like, for each of these modules is cross-product. And this is interesting to dig through, because I know a lot of the time we're talking about the detail of building on the Teams platform and developing on the Teams platform. But actually, we all use Teams every day as well. We all use Microsoft 365 to get stuff done. And I certainly do. You probably do. And so it's worth thinking about how we do business. You know, how we get our stuff done, how the tools that we use, are we using them in the best way? How are we dealing with things like, you know, just massive notifications, sprawl everywhere, duplicated data, like all these things, you know, are we using Teams correctly? Are we using Microsoft 365 correctly? So Starley goes through these 4 areas, which are capturing. So like capturing the ideas, the thoughts, the tips, the meeting notes, the documents, whatever it is, capturing stuff and storing it in the right place, processing, executing, figuring out what needs to be done, and then a whole module on Teams culture, which I thought was really interesting. You know, the realization that for many people, their entire workday is now centered around Microsoft Teams, and people live their entire workday through Teams. So how is that team structured? How should a Teams ecosystem be structured for, you know, a productive day and a productive company? What should that look like? What policy should be in place? You know, when should you use what? And then an entire section on notifications, which I thought was really interesting. Really interesting. And actually, Starley says notifications is the #1 skill everybody needs to master in the next decade, which I thought was really interesting. Really interesting. Like, notifications are a problem. Understanding and owning notifications, I think, is a superpower if you can get it right. It's hard to do, but 100%, for me, it is the difference between how you run your day and whether or not you run your day at all or whether other people run your day. So notifications are a good thing. They can also be a bad thing. And then finally, it kind of wraps up with kind of some other information just to kind of tie it all together. Starley's done some things like this before. Like he did this really cool Pomodoro plugin for Skype for Business, and I think he did one for Teams as well. I'm a big fan of the Pomodoro technique, so I've used both iterations of those. I've got a similar kind of planning system that I use. It's slightly different, but the important thing though is recognizing that all of this stuff is happening, and I think you ignore it at your peril. It's easy kind of to think about it as someone else's problem or an optional step or something that other people should worry about and not you. But actually, I think we all have this problem. So it's good to take ownership of it and at least understand more about it. Like, you might not change anything straight away, and you might not think you have to, and that's fine. But I think just understanding it and being more aware of some of the meta of what happens in your day and what happens in your week and how you work, I think is really good for us to do. And I think it's important, and we'll have productivity gains, but also we'll have, other benefits as well around sort of well-being and just kind of mental happiness, I think. So I commend this set of 4 videos to you. I think they're really good. And they're not long either. They're not super long. So the first one is only 14 minutes. So anybody can find 14 minutes. If you can't find 14 minutes in your day, then you definitely need to watch all of these, because you are structuring your day somewhat incorrectly, I would say. So there we go. If you have 14 minutes, you should still watch this anyway, even if you think you've got your system on point. But you will still pick up tips, I think, from listening to Starley talk. So definitely worth a watch. Finally, I just want to bring your attention to a video I did in the week that I didn't blog about because it's not really Teams dev. Again, it kind of falls into like, I use Teams every day, and so this is a video about me using Teams rather than it specifically around Teams development. And this is a video I did around using OBS in Teams and Zoom for video and sound. So I previously did a version of this. So this is my kind of 2022 update version of that, because the setup has changed slightly. I use OBS a lot. I'm using OBS right now. But I also join Teams calls and Zoom calls using OBS, but not just for the video, also for the sound. And I don't see that as a very common occurrence. So I wanted to do a little video about it just to kind of explain the why, why route your sound through OBS, and also the how to do it. And last time I did it, there were all kind of sorts of things wrong with my setup and the trade-offs, really. There are still trade-offs today in the 2022 setup, but I think they're slightly less, so it might work out for you. So if that sounds interesting, if you want to give that a go, if you are a teacher, if you present an awful lot on Teams and you want to have a bit more control over your video feed, if you want to experiment with different scenes and things like that, or you want to insert audio clips or sound effects or modulate your voice or change how your voice appears or anything like that, then this is all worth looking into. I don't do any of those things. I use the scene stuff a bit, but for me, the sound is a really big one, because I find I can get a much better quality sound going through OBS with the microphone setup I currently have than if I was to go direct. So for me, that's the reason to do it. So that's on my YouTube channel. You can go check that out. Again, I'll put a link in the description. And I think that's pretty much it for me this week. We've got Teams Nation coming up next week, I think. So looking forward to that a lot. That's going to be a big event in the calendar, and kind of kicks off for me. Certainly kicks off the conference season. So that will be really good. I'm going to be talking about ACS and building things for business to consumer applications. So if that sounds interesting, you can check out the Teams Nation schedule. So I'm going to spend some time this week preparing for that. Apart from that, I think that's everything. So have a great week, whatever it is you're doing, and I will talk to you again next time.